Story number 1.
I had always thought I understood what fear was. The occasional bump in the night, the suspenseful scenes in movies, the unnerving feeling of being watched. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for that night. The night everything changed. It started off like any other evening. I had been driving home after a long shift at work, exhausted and eager to get to bed. The weather was unremarkable, just the steady drizzle of rain that had been falling since the afternoon. As usual, I took the back roads to avoid the traffic. My small town was peaceful, and the roads were familiar, comforting even in their predictable emptiness. That night, however, was different. I can't pinpoint exactly when it started to feel off, but it didn't take long for me to sense it. Maybe it was the way the rain hit the windshield harder, or how the darkness seemed deeper than usual, pressing in from all sides. I tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to the exhaustion. The last couple of weeks had been stressful. Work had been particularly grueling, and my mind had been in overdrive. Maybe that was all it was. I rounded the corner of an old, forgotten street, one that hadn't seen much traffic in years, when I noticed a figure standing under a street lamp. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the light, but as I got closer, I could make out a shape. A person, standing still, facing the road. I slowed the car, unsure of what to do. The person didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. The light illuminated them, revealing an older man, his head slightly bowed, his face obscured by the shadows of his hood. I couldn't make out any features, just the vague outline of a person standing there in the rain. Something about the way he stood there made me uneasy. Maybe it was the stillness, how he didn't flinch when my car neared him. Or maybe it was the unsettling thought that I didn't recognize him, despite how small this town was. I felt a strange compulsion to stop, to roll down my window and ask if he needed help. But then another thought struck me. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen anyone standing out here at this time of night. Was he lost? Why didn't he have an umbrella? Why didn't he try to wave me down? Instead of stopping, I pressed my foot on the gas, telling myself to keep moving. But as I drove past him, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. And there he was, still standing in the same position, still facing the road, unmoving. I shook my head and tried to focus on the road ahead, but my eyes kept drifting back to the rearview mirror. Something in me couldn't shake the image of that figure. So still, so unnatural. It was like he wasn't a part of this world, as if he was waiting for something. When I turned onto my street, I breathed a sigh of relief, hoping the tension would ease, but it only seemed to build. The house stood at the end of the road, the lights flickering in the window as if to welcome me. I parked the car and got out, feeling a sense of dread settle over me. The rain had let up slightly, but the air still felt thick and heavy, like something was about to happen. I walked quickly to the front door, fumbling with my keys, still unsettled by the encounter. The moment I stepped inside, I locked the door behind me, feeling a sense of safety, but it wasn't enough. The house felt different. There was an unnatural silence in the air, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I went into the living room and dropped my bag on the couch. Something was off. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out to find a text message from my brother, Jason. He lived in a neighboring city, and we didn't often talk outside of family events. "Hey, you all right? I know you've been working late. Just wanted to check in. You still awake?" I frowned. It was 11:45 p.m., late for Jason to be awake. He wasn't a night owl like I was. I typed back quickly, "Yeah, just got home. Weird night. I think I'm just tired." Jason's reply came almost immediately. "Did you see the news?" I paused. News? What news? I couldn't recall anything significant happening recently, at least not in our small town. I pulled up my local news app and checked the latest updates. There was nothing remarkable. But then, near the bottom of the feed, a small story caught my eye. Unexplained disappearance in Oakwood County. Local man vanishes without a trace. Authorities searching for answers. The article gave no specifics, just the basics. A man in his late 60s had gone missing, last seen walking home in the early evening. There was a brief description of him, tall, with a hooded raincoat, and no further information. My heart skipped a beat. The figure under the street lamp. Could it be the same person? I shook my head. No, that wasn't possible. He was just some random man, someone who had lost their way. Still, I felt the growing unease in my gut. I texted back to Jason asking if he had any other details. The reply came after a few minutes. He was the last person seen in that area. But the strange thing is, the search dogs couldn't track him. They just lost his scent right by that street. They think he might have been taken. Taken? My stomach churned. Before I could reply, I heard a soft thud coming from the back of the house. My first thought was that it was just the house settling, the wind knocking something over. But the sound came again, louder this time, as if something or someone had dropped something heavy. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and walked cautiously toward the back door. The house was eerily quiet, and every step I took seemed to echo in the silence. My hand was shaking slightly as I reached for the door handle, but I steeled myself. There was nothing out there. I was just overthinking things. I opened the door, shining the flashlight outside. The backyard was empty. Nothing moved. Nothing was out of place. But my eyes were drawn to the far corner of the yard, to the shadow of the tall oak tree. And that's when I saw him, the man from the street. He stood under the tree, just like before, motionless, facing me. My blood ran cold. He was too far for me to make out his face, but I could see the outline of his hood and the long, weathered coat. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. What was he doing here? How had he gotten into my backyard? My mind raced, but I couldn't make sense of it. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, my mind reeling. I rushed to the living room and called Jason, but no answer. The house was growing colder, the silence pressing in from all sides. I grabbed my phone again, dialing the number for the police. But just as the call was ringing, I froze. A knock at the front door. I didn't move. I couldn't. The knock came again, slower this time, deliberate. I glanced through the peephole, but no one was there. I opened the door cautiously, peering outside. The porch was empty. The wind picked up again, and I slammed the door shut, panting. I felt like I was suffocating, like the walls of the house were closing in on me. I ran to the back door again, but when I reached it, the backyard was empty. The man was gone. I collapsed on the couch, unable to stop shaking. My phone buzzed in my hand. Jason had replied, "Don't go outside. Don't open the door." I didn't even have time to process the text before the knock came again. This time it wasn't on the door, it was on the window, just behind me. I couldn't breathe. I turned slowly, my heart racing, to face the window. And there, on the other side, was the man. He was standing there, staring at me through the glass, his face hidden beneath the hood. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The night was unusually quiet, an eerie stillness that seemed to make every sound more pronounced. I'd just moved into a new apartment, a cozy one-bedroom unit in an older building just a few blocks away from the heart of the city. I'd been looking for a place for months, and this one seemed perfect. The price was right, the location was ideal, and the landlord, Mr. Fields, had been kind enough to give me a tour when I first inquired. He was a bit odd, though. A little too old-fashioned, like stepped out of the 1950s with his heavy frame and old-school manners. I'd figured it was just his personality, so I didn't think much of it. The first few nights were peaceful. I spent my evenings unpacking and settling in. The apartment was small, but it had character. The wood floors creaked with every step. The windows rattled slightly when the wind blew, and the walls were thin enough to hear muffled sounds from the neighbors. Still, it like home. It was a quiet building, and I figured I'd be left alone. But tonight, something felt off. I had just finished making dinner when I heard a faint knock at the door. It was so soft, it almost sounded like a tap against the wood, and I froze. It was already past midnight, and I hadn't been expecting anyone. I hadn't even heard footsteps in the hallway, so I wondered if I was imagining it. I walked over to the door cautiously and peered through the peephole. There was no one there. My heart raced for a moment as I stood there, staring at the empty hallway. I tried to brush it off. I was just tired. Maybe it was the wind or something else. But just as I was about to turn away, I heard it again. This time it was louder, more distinct. A knock, followed by a soft scraping sound like something sliding along the floor. I opened the door quickly, but no one was there. I stepped out into the hallway, my bare feet cold against the hardwood. The hall was dim, lit only by the flickering overhead light. I glanced in both directions, but there was no sign of anyone. I stood there for a few moments, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it was the pipes. Old buildings like this sometimes made odd noises at night. I closed the door behind me and locked it, trying to shake off the unease. Uh, the feeling of being watched lingered, though, and I couldn't ignore it. I made my way back to the living room, my mind racing. There was no logical explanation for what had happened. I sat back down on the couch, but I couldn't relax. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone there. But the apartment was still, and nothing seemed out of place. It wasn't until I tried to go to bed that things started to escalate. The apartment had one bedroom, and the bed was positioned near the far wall, opposite the window. The walls were paper thin, and I could hear the faint sounds of the neighbors moving around. I tried to ignore it, but the noises outside my window grew louder, more unsettling. At first, I thought it was just the sound of cars passing by, but then it turned into something else. It sounded like someone was walking around outside my apartment, pacing back and forth. I lay in bed, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had moved here alone, and I was used to being by myself, but I was starting to feel paranoid. The soft clicking of footsteps outside continued, getting closer and closer to my window. I got up, pulled the curtains aside, and peered out into the night. But there was no one there. The street below was empty, the only sound the distant hum of traffic far down the block. I felt ridiculous for even thinking there was someone out there. I closed the curtains and returned to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind felt like someone was trying to get my attention. I tossed and turned, my mind racing, until I finally fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease from the night before. I convinced myself I was just adjusting to my new surroundings. The building was old, and old buildings made strange noises. That was all it was. But something about last night still nagged at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As the days went by, things got stranger. I started hearing footsteps at night again, but this time they weren't just outside my window. They were inside my apartment. Soft, slow steps that echoed from the hallway and into the living room. I would wake up, heart pounding, to the sound of someone walking through the apartment, but when I would check, there was no one there. The noises grew louder over the course of the week. The scraping sound from the door, like something was being dragged along the floor. The faint knocks. I started to avoid the hallway entirely, staying in the living room with all the lights on. But it didn't stop. One night, around 3 a.m., I heard it again. The scraping. It was coming from my bedroom this time. I froze, my heart in my throat. I wasn't imagining it. Someone, or something, was in my apartment. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a lamp, and slowly crept down the hallway toward my bedroom. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, my skin prickling with dread. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, the light from the hallway casting a long shadow across the floor. The scraping sound was louder now, almost rhythmic, like someone dragging furniture across the floor. I didn't know if I was ready to face whatever was making the noise, but I had to. I pushed the door open. My heart stopped. There, in the middle of the room, was a large wooden chest. I didn't own a wooden chest. I had never seen it before in my life. I took a step back, feeling dizzy. The scraping sound stopped as soon as I entered the room, and the silence was deafening. My eyes darted from the chest to the window, trying to make sense of what was happening. There were no signs of forced entry, no explanation for how the chest had gotten there. It just appeared. I walked toward it, every step feeling heavier than the last. The closer I got, the more intense the feeling of dread became. I reached for the lid, my hands trembling, and slowly pulled it open. Inside, there was nothing. Just empty space. No hidden secrets. No creepy messages. Nothing at all. I breathed a sigh of relief, but the relief was short-lived. My eyes fell on the back wall of the bedroom, where something strange was written on the paint. It wasn't visible from where I stood, but as I stepped closer, the message became clearer. "Get out!" I stared at the words, frozen in place. My mind raced as I tried to process what I was seeing. I hadn't written that. No one had. The words were scrawled haphazardly, as if written by someone in a hurry, with frantic strokes that dug into the paint. I backed away from the wall, my chest tightening. The apartment had been quiet when I first moved in, but now it felt like it was alive with something dark, something that didn't want me here. I ran out of the room and slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this place before whatever was haunting it took me. But just as I was about to head for the door, I heard it again. The knock. This time it was coming from inside the apartment. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible. But as I listened, it grew louder, more persistent. It was coming from behind me, from the kitchen. I turned slowly, the blood draining from my face as the knocking grew faster, more insistent. I bolted toward the door, my hand shaking as I grabbed the knob, but before I could open it, the knock stopped. And then, just as quickly, a voice whispered through the stillness of the apartment. "You're not leaving." I whirled around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. I turned back to the door and ran out of the apartment, never looking back. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
I should have known better than to take the apartment. But when you're living paycheck to paycheck and you're desperate for a place to stay, you'll take what you can get. I was young, single, and in a city that never seemed to slow down. The last thing on my mind was checking into the history of the building I was moving into. I was focused on the rent being cheap, the fact that it was relatively close to my work, and the idea that I could finally have a space to call my own. It wasn't an amazing place. The building was old, at least 50 years old, probably older, and you could tell by the way the walls creaked every time you moved. The paint on the walls was chipped, the floorboards warped in spots, and the plumbing was noisy. But it wasn't the state of the building that unsettled me. It was the things I started noticing once I moved in. The first night in my new apartment, I was nervous. It wasn't just because I was alone in an unfamiliar place, but because I'd heard rumors about the building. People said it was haunted. They told stories about the previous tenants who had left suddenly, or worse, who had vanished without a trace. Of course, I didn't take those stories seriously. I brushed them off as urban legends, like the ones you hear in every city. But as the night wore on, I began to wonder if there was something to the stories. It started with the noises. At first, it was nothing. The house settling, the wind rattling the old windows, and the occasional sound of footsteps from upstairs. Probably just the neighbors, I told myself. But the noises didn't stop. They came at odd hours of the night. I would be lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, and I'd hear a faint tapping on the walls. It wasn't like a mouse scurrying around. No, it was rhythmic, like someone gently knocking on the walls. I got up the first time I heard it, thinking someone was at my door, but when I checked, there was nothing. No one in the hallway, no sign of anyone having been there. Just a silence that felt almost suffocating. The next night, the tapping came again, but this time it was louder. I turned on the lights, walked through the apartment, checked every room. Nothing. The air felt thick, like the apartment was holding its breath. I couldn't explain it, but there was an overwhelming sense of unease that settled over me. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The tapping had turned into scraping, like something or someone was dragging something heavy along the floor. The noise came from the apartment above me, and at first, I thought it was just my neighbor moving furniture around at an odd hour. But when I went up to the apartment to ask, there was no answer. I knocked on the door, waited, but no one ever came to greet me. I returned to my own apartment, still unsettled, and decided to try and sleep. But then the scraping started again. This time, it was unmistakably coming from inside my apartment. I stood frozen in place, my heart racing. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear the dragging sound moving along the floor, getting closer. Slowly, I backed away, instinctively reaching for something, anything, to defend myself. But there was nothing. No one. Nothing that could explain the sound. I stayed awake the rest of the night, trying to convince myself it was just the building, that the noise was from the pipes or something else entirely. But every time I closed my eyes, the noise came back. It was persistent and relentless, scratching and scraping like fingernails against the wood. The next day, I made up my mind to speak with the landlord, Mr. Thompson. He was an older man, always dressed in a suit that looked like it had been worn far too many times. He gave off a strange vibe, Something unsettling but not overtly alarming. I had heard that he was the original owner of the building, and I figured he would know more about it than anyone else. When I walked into his office, he was sitting behind a desk cluttered with papers, his glasses perched on the tip of his nose. He looked up when I entered, but he didn't smile. There was no greeting, just a cold stare that made my skin prickle. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice flat and emotionless. I hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I'm having some trouble with the apartment. Strange noises at night, scraping, tapping. I'm not sure what it is." Uh, Mr. Thompson didn't blink, didn't flinch. He just looked at me with those cold, assessing eyes. "The apartment's old," he said finally. "Buildings like this settle. You're probably just hearing the pipes or the wind. It's nothing to worry about." I wasn't convinced, but it sounds different, like something's moving around in there. And I've heard that the tenants before me left suddenly. What happened to them? He stiffened at that. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought he might say something more, but he didn't. Instead, he just cleared his throat and stood up. "It's an old building. Things happen, people come and go, but you should be fine," he said, his voice clipped. "Now, is there anything else?" I didn't want to push him any further. He didn't seem interested in talking, and frankly, I was starting to get the feeling that I wasn't going to get any answers, so I left his office feeling more unsettled than before. That night, the noises were worse. I lay in bed, wide awake, listening. The scraping sound started again, but this time it was different. There was a new sound mixed in, a low, whispering murmur, like voices from far away. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were angry. I got out of bed, the floor cold beneath my feet, and crept into the hallway. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the faint smell of something sour lingered in the walls. I slowly approached the source of the noise, the living room, the center of the apartment. That's when I saw it. The closet door was wide open. I hadn't left it open, and I was certain it had been closed earlier. Inside, the shadows were darker than they should have been. I stepped closer, heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw it. The wall behind the closet was covered in faint, scratching marks. They looked almost like they had been made by fingernails. Long, deep scratches, as if something had been trying to claw its way out. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind was racing. Was this just my imagination? Or was something in the apartment, something I couldn't see, trying to get out? I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I spent the hours pacing around the apartment, listening to every noise, every creak, every whisper. The air grew heavier, thicker with each passing minute until it felt suffocating. In the morning, I packed my bags. I couldn't stay there anymore. The building, the noises, the feeling of being watched. None of it made sense, but I couldn't shake the terror that had taken root in my chest. I had to leave. But before I left, I did one last thing. I went back to Mr. Thompson's office. This time when I walked in, he was sitting at his desk, but he didn't look up at me. He didn't acknowledge me at all. I stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to say. Finally, I spoke. "I'm leaving," I told him. "I can't stay here." He didn't look up. "I figured you would." I turned to leave, but then I stopped. There was one last question I needed to ask. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Why didn't you warn me about what's in this building?" Mr. Thompson finally looked up at me, his eyes empty. He didn't answer right away, but after a long silence, he spoke. "Some things are better left unknown." And with that, he turned away, his eyes going back to the papers on his desk. I left the building and never looked back. But every night when I close my eyes, I can still hear the scraping, the whispering. And I can't help but wonder what Mr. Thompson knew that he never told me. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was one of those nights where the darkness seemed thicker than usual, like a suffocating blanket wrapped around the small cabin in the woods. Sarah pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, trying to shake off the sense of unease. It had been her idea to rent the isolated cabin for a week, hoping the quiet would help her finish her latest novel. A horror story, ironically. The cabin was quaint and charming during the day. White shutters, wildflowers in front, a narrow path leading to the forest. At night, however, it felt different. The trees seemed to lean closer, as if straining to listen to her movements inside. The only source of light was the flickering fireplace, and a single lantern hung near the door. Sarah leaned back on the couch with her laptop perched on her knees and stared at the blank document on the screen. Her mind was empty, save for the discomfort gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. She could hear the wind picking up outside, leaves rustling like skeletal fingers scraping against the windows. After hours of attempting to write, Sarah gave up. She shut her laptop and decided to make tea, hoping the familiar routine would settle her nerves. As she filled the kettle, a sharp bang sounded from the porch. Startled, she almost dropped the pot. Her heart pounded as she strained to hear, but the only sound was the howling wind. When the tea was ready, she tried to brush it off as a branch hitting the cabin. She sipped slowly, trying to ignore the creeping paranoia. Suddenly, there was another bang, louder, closer. This time, it sounded like something heavy hitting the door. She froze, her hand trembling as she set the mug down. Cautiously, she crept to the window beside the door and peeked through the curtains. Darkness. Nothing but shadows moving with the wind. She flicked on the porch light, but the bulb flickered and died. Great. Trying to shake off the jitters, she secured the door and moved back to the couch. She hadn't seen anyone for miles when she arrived. Who could possibly be out there? Maybe an animal. A bear? That thought didn't comfort her. The banging didn't return, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Sarah kept glancing at the windows, half expecting a face to appear. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of her, and she fell into a restless sleep on the couch. Around 3 a.m., a sudden noise yanked her from her sleep, a scraping sound like metal dragging against wood. Disoriented and still half dreaming, she sat up and listened. It came again, longer this time. Heart racing, she followed the sound to the back door, the one leading to the forest. Pressing her ear to the door, she could hear it clearly now, a deliberate, slow, dragging sound. Summoning courage, she opened the curtains just a crack. In the faint glow of the dying fire, she saw something that made her stomach drop. A long, thin scratch running vertically down the wooden door, still fresh. She bolted the door, double-checking the lock, and hurried back to the living room. The air felt colder, as if the temperature had plummeted in minutes. Her phone had no signal, of course, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. She cursed herself for choosing this godforsaken cabin. Just as she tried to rationalize the scratch, another sound came, this time from the roof. Slow, heavy footsteps creaking the wooden beams. Someone was up there, walking carefully. Sarah's skin prickled, every instinct telling her to stay quiet. She grabbed the fire poker and crouched behind the couch, straining to listen. The footsteps continued, slowly moving from one side of the roof to the other. A thud followed by a long, dragging scrape. It sounded like something being pulled along the roof, something heavy. Suddenly the noise stopped. Sarah held her breath, ears ringing from the tension. Silence. Minutes stretched out, and she dared to hope that whatever it was had left. Then, without warning, the back door handle rattled violently. Sarah stifled a scream, gripping the poker so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could see the handle jerking up and down as if someone was desperately trying to get inside. Panic surged as she realized that whatever it was knew she was in there. The rattling stopped abruptly, and then the dragging noise started again, this time from the side of the cabin. Curious, despite her terror, Sarah crept to the side window and peered out. In the dim moonlight, she saw it. A figure, tall and hunched, dragging something long and metallic along the wall. It moved with unnatural slowness, head cocked at a strange angle. Her stomach flipped when she recognized what it was dragging, a rusted scythe, scraping against the wooden walls as it moved. The figure stopped directly beneath the window. Sarah froze, barely daring to breathe. The figure suddenly jerked its head up, staring straight at her. Hollow eyes reflected the moonlight, and a twisted grin split its face. Sarah stumbled backward, barely containing a scream. She scrambled to find her phone, fingers trembling as she dialed 911. No signal. Of course. In a panic, she barricaded herself in the bathroom, locking the door and praying for morning to come. She stayed there for hours, listening as the dragging sound moved around the cabin, occasionally punctuated by soft tapping on the windows. At dawn, the noises ceased. When Sarah finally mustered the courage to look outside, the yard was empty. The ground around the cabin, however, was marked with deep scratches, as if something sharp had been dragged in wide arcs. She didn't bother packing. Grabbing her keys, she sped down the dirt road, leaving the cabin behind. The caretaker called her later that day, confused and worried. He asked why the back door was scratched up and why there were deep gouges in the roof. Sarah didn't have an answer. All she knew was that she'd never go back. Days later, a news article caught her eye. Another writer had rented the same cabin and gone missing. The search party found the place abandoned, the back door hanging open, and long, fresh scratches marking the walls. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I had never considered myself someone who believed in ghosts, demons, or anything supernatural. I was rational, skeptical, and thought that most stories people told were just the result of overactive imaginations or simple coincidence. That changed when I moved into that old house on Hillview Street. The house was exactly what I had been looking for: cheap, spacious, and in a quiet part of town. I had just gotten a job in the area and needed a place to stay, but most apartments in the city were either too expensive or too small for what I wanted. Hillview Street was known for its old homes, mostly vacant, and I had always driven by them, admiring their grand, albeit worn-down, architecture. So when I saw a for rent sign on one of the properties, I didn't think twice before calling the number. The landlord, Mrs. Parker, was an older woman, very pleasant on the phone. When I went to meet her, she explained that the house had been in her family for generations. It wasn't a particularly well-maintained house. There were signs of age, cracked windows, peeling wallpaper, a creaky staircase, but it had character. The rent was unbelievably low, and after a brief tour, I was sold. I figured a little renovation could be done on my own over time. The first few days were uneventful. The house was quiet, peaceful. The creaking of the floorboards at night didn't bother me. I actually found it charming, like the house had a life of its own, settling into its foundation after all these years. But by the fourth night, something changed. It started with a sound. I was lying in bed, just about to fall asleep, when I heard something from upstairs. It was subtle at first, just a faint tapping, like a finger lightly rapping on wood. I thought it was just the house settling. I ignored it. But the tapping continued, growing a little louder each time. It wasn't like the sound of footsteps, more like a rhythmic, deliberate tapping. After a few minutes, it stopped. I tried to push the noise out of my mind, convincing myself it was just an old house making its usual sounds. But then it happened again the next night, and the night after that. By the fifth night, I decided I had to investigate. I walked upstairs and stood in the hallway, listening closely. The sound was coming from the room at the end of the hall. The door was closed. I hadn't explored that room yet. It was the only room I hadn't gone into when I moved in. But something about the sound, it was so odd, so persistent, compelled me to open the door. When I did, I immediately regretted it. The room was dark, and as I stepped inside, the air felt different, colder somehow. It was as if the room had been sealed off for years, untouched. The wallpaper was old and peeling, and the floorboards creaked under my weight as I walked across the room. There was a thick layer of dust on everything: furniture, the floor, the windowsills. But what struck me the most was the window. It was wide open, though the night was cold and the wind was howling outside. The curtains fluttered slightly, and I could hear the faint tapping again, this time from the windowsill. I didn't know why, but something made me walk closer to the window. I reached out and closed it. As soon as I did, the tapping stopped. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. But I couldn't. There was something about that room, something that didn't sit right with me. I quickly left, shutting the door behind me and locking it. The next few days passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every time I walked through the hall, I would feel an odd sensation of being followed, like invisible eyes were tracking my movements. But I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, or perhaps the result of moving into an unfamiliar place. Then came the dreams. At first, it was just a vague sense of unease. In my dreams, I would wander through dark, shadowy hallways, searching for something I couldn't quite name. I felt lost, as if I didn't belong. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, drenched in sweat. The dreams became more vivid over the next few nights, more detailed. I saw a figure in the distance, just beyond the reach of my vision, but whenever I tried to get closer, the figure would vanish. The air would grow colder, the shadows deeper, and I would wake up again, terrified. I began to avoid the upstairs room. I couldn't bring myself to go near it, not after the strange sensation I had felt in there. But then one night, I couldn't help myself. I had to go back. Something was pulling me toward that room, like a magnetic force I couldn't resist. I walked upstairs and opened the door, not sure why I was doing it. The room was exactly the same as before, cold, dusty, abandoned. But this time, the window was wide open again. As I approached the window, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. In the dim light, there was something etched into the wood of the window frame. At first, it was just a few scratches, nothing too significant. But as I looked closer, I realized the scratches formed words. I leaned in, my breath catching in my throat as I read them. "Get out." My heart stopped. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I had no idea what was going on. I thought about leaving, about walking out of that house and never looking back. But something kept me there. Something in that room, in the house itself, seemed to hold me captive, as though it was telling me to stay. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of tapping came again, louder this time, as if it was right outside my door. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head, but the sound was relentless. Tap, tap, tap. It grew louder, closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed and opened the door, ready to confront whatever was making the noise. There, at the end of the hallway, was a figure standing in the darkness. It was tall, gaunt, and draped in shadows. I could barely make out any details, but I could feel the presence, the weight of it. The figure didn't move, but I knew it was watching me. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, unmoving, staring. I stepped forward, but as I did, the figure slowly began to fade. It dissolved into the shadows, vanishing as if it had never been there. I rushed to the spot where it had been standing, but there was nothing, just the cold emptiness of the hallway. The tapping stopped. That night, I called Mrs. Parker. I didn't know why, but I had to. I needed answers, or at least some explanation. When she answered, I could hear the fatigue in her voice. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. "There's something wrong with this house. Strange noises. A figure. I don't know what's happening." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before she finally spoke. "You're not the first," she said, her voice low and almost sorrowful. "There's always been something off about that house. My family has lived there for generations. We've never talked about it. But there are stories. People who've lived there, they've experienced things they couldn't explain." She sighed. "I don't know why it's happening now. Maybe it's been dormant for years, but I've always known that house is cursed. I should have told you before you moved in. But I thought you could handle it." I didn't know what to say. I was terrified, but there was a strange sense of relief too. At least someone else knew what I was going through. Mrs. Parker gave me a warning. "Get out while you still can. Leave before it's too late." But it was already too late. The house had already claimed me. That night, the tapping started again, but this time it wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a cold, oppressive weight pressing down on me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow longer, thicker, until they completely engulfed me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I don't remember how I left the house. All I know is that when I woke up the next morning, I was sitting on the steps outside, the house looming behind me like a dark, silent monster. I never went back. I'm not sure what I saw or what happened in that house, but I know one thing for sure. Some places are better left alone. Story the end?